Cue the dramatic music. From Washington to Obama on this President's Day, we put the first 44 U.S. presidents in perspective. How the view from the Oval Office has changed when it comes to the military, the media, the power of the office, even how our presidents age. The first 44 are President's Day special. Hello and a happy President's Day to you. Thank you so much for joining us, and we hope the holiday has been both a happy and a safe one. And tonight we present a special President's Day look at the first 44, and to help us do just that, we are enlisting the services of three preeminent presidential historians: David Woolner, senior fellow and resident Hyde Park historian for the Roosevelt Institute, as well as an expert on all things Franklin Roosevelt; Dr. Janet Michkowski, professor of history at Dowling College. He's written extensively about not just Gerald Ford, but other presidents as well. Duron Taylor, assistant professor at Pace University, and teaches American presidential and constitutional history, among other subjects. And a familiar face, Andrew Whitman, our senior political correspondent. All right, and first up tonight, guys, is the use of military force, an apropos subject given the headlines this past week. And also we discuss how it has changed in the last two generations. Now this month, it marks the 50th anniversary of President Lyndon Johnson approving the bombing of North Vietnam. That move, it began the ratcheting up of conflict there, eventually growing into the divisive and controversial war that Vietnam became. And by the end of the war in 1975, almost 3 million Americans had served there, 300,000 wounded, and 58,000 Americans died. The war deeply unpopular in the U.S., leading to even civil disobedience as well as those widespread protests, all for a war that the U.S. lost. The communist North Vietnamese eventually took over the entire nation, and the echoes of Vietnam have been felt in every American war or conflict since. The first Gulf War, the first President Bush insisting on using overwhelming force to end the fighting quickly, a decision that explains why he decided not to send troops into Baghdad. Vietnam also impacted the post-9/11 wars in both Iraq and Afghanistan. The second President Bush keeping troop levels low, perhaps some would argue too low, and chose not to draft Americans into military service, as the U.S. obviously had done in Vietnam, but not since. And now, with the debate over the use of force against ISIS, there is a widespread belief that Americans do not have the stomach or even the patience for long-term use of ground troops. All right, let's bring this in. And the significance of Vietnam, David, I think, cannot be exaggerated for every future president and going forward, about maybe unintended consequences, about the limits of American power, about the non-traditional enemy, and you see it playing out. And we even see it playing out, last week as it relates to the president going to Congress. He wouldn't even have to get authorization. It has so many echoes, doesn't it?
It certainly does, and as my colleagues I'm sure will agree, Vietnam has an enormous impact on U.S. policy going forward. And one of the immediate consequences, of course, was the 1973 War Powers Resolution, where Congress tried to assert its authority and actually overrode President Nixon's veto and said the president must consult, the president must notify Congress if military force is going to be used. It put a 60-day time limit on the use of American military forces, after which it could be initiated, but the president is essentially supposed to go to Congress, and Congress is supposed to be fully engaged, as my colleagues will certainly agree. And no president since then has recognized that as constitutional. It's never been tested in its full provision all the way up to the Supreme Court, but presidents since then have tended to notify Congress, have tended to engage Congress, have sometimes asked for resolution, but they always say, I don't need to do this, I'm doing this because, essentially it's a kind of tipping their hat to Congress. But, again, constitutionally, it's been regarded by the executive branch as not being necessary. And it's very interesting to look at the different cases since 1941, when the United States has gone into war, whether it's Truman going into Korea without a declaration of war, or the first President Bush saying, I have enough authority with the United Nations. In both cases, Truman and Bush using the United Nations as the raison d'etre for war. So Congress has been trying to assert itself to a certain extent. They have, but it's again, this tug of war continues.
Jaco, it's funny because I knew you were going to be on the panel tonight, and you've written extensively of Eisenhower. I wonder if we'll see a day where a general or war commander, the powers they had then and the outsized presence they had then versus what we see with conflicts now, if we'll ever see a general go from the military to the Oval Office.
It's interesting. The usual path in our country's history has been, or a common path has been, military heroes entering into the presidency. But nowadays, you have a lot of commanders-in-chief, some of the recent ones, without direct combat experience. And so that path, is, especially with the end of the Cold War, that lessened the premium on having some kind of military service. And Clinton marked the start of this pattern of non-veteran commanders-in-chief.
And if I could interrupt, you could speak to, for people who maybe aren't as students of history, Eisenhower was not the hawk that people would have assumed. And people who serve, they understand the limits of what a military can do. They understand the challenges if there's a non-defined mission or what the end game is to things. They understand a soldier's life as well and all that comes along with it. In many ways, while nobody thinks it needs to be a prerequisite, there is something lost not having that perspective, isn't there?
Yeah, one of Eisenhower's big achievements, and he was very proud of it, was not only keeping America's internationalist profile very high after World War II, but also keeping the peace. In fact, he entitled the second volume of his White House memoirs, Waging Peace. Not waging war, waging peace. And he was very proud of the peace and prosperity that he presided over for 8 years.
Andrew?
Well, I think there's an irony in all of this. While I think presidents have been somewhat more cautious when it comes to using military force on the large scale since Vietnam, as we've seen in the Gulf Wars and other conflicts, it seems like presidents have greater reach on smaller conflict levels, with the use of drones or sending in surgical teams or as we saw with President Clinton in Kosovo, or other issues that have popped up. And I'm curious if the historians can speak to that, because it's, again, on the larger conflicts, it seems like the presidents are a little bit more boxed in, but not, it seems like they have greater flexibility on little hot spots that pop up.
Well, there's been, and I'm sure my colleagues will agree, there's a growing recognition now that the U.S. presidents have much greater authority offshore than they do, domestically. The domestic prerogatives of a president, being checked by Congress, but the powers inherent in this idea of commander-in-chief, have grown, I think, pretty substantially. And a lot of it has to do with technology. Mm-hmm. And it's true, smaller wars, but then the Gulf War, the invasion of Iraq, these are not small conflicts. And I think what's changed is our technological abilities means that the force levels can be lower. I think Richard is absolutely right. I mean, Colin Powell was livid, and the general.
If you think about the voice that was most concerned,
right.
It was Powell, who was a military man. During we talk about the echoes of Vietnam, I think one of the byproducts of that is commanders-in-chief no longer get the benefit of the doubts on these things. I mean, sure, after 9/11, whatever any commander-in-chief would have done, the country would have been behind them as long as it was said forcefully. But whether it's sticking a toe into a conflict or some undefined thing, once bitten, twice shy, or how many times bitten, how many times shy, the public and the polls seem to reflect this, is saying, you better give us all the answers before we start. And sometimes you can't do that in war, but that's the sentiment. Seemingly it's changed.
Yeah, the technology has changed, as David was talking about, but I think the people are better informed, partially because of that, and the people are getting more cynical. Because people say, look, are we going into this war because we have to, or is it a matter of, as the film once put it, wagging the dog? What political purpose is this military action serving to take the heat off of a president, or to somehow enhance his standing before the next election, whatever it might be? And we've been bitten, and people get very cynical about it, and it does make an impact on the political support that the president has for that military action, even if it's being entered into for the best of reasons.
Right.
So the president has to pay attention to that.
Yeah, in that sense, I think Iraq is a lot like Vietnam. I mean, the legacy of Vietnam was a great reluctance, a great caution on the part of the public. After 9/11, of course, people were understanding that we needed to get into Afghanistan, we needed to put al-Qaeda out of business, but the invasion of Iraq and the consequences of that again, and now with Syria, there's a great deal of caution and reluctance, I think, on the part of the public to get involved.
And I think the public, They want the banner when to see it mission accomplished, but they want it to be the punctuation point. They don't want it to be a second act or a third act or whatever else. As you said, fatigue, I think, is the right word. Okay, when we come back on our President's Day special, real-life presidents is portrayed on film and TV. Do the big screen presidents change the way that we think of the real presidents? And if so, is that fair to people who once occupied the Oval Office? Stay with us.